The Be Quiet Darkrock TF was launched way back around 2016, however, back then the Darkrock TF and other high-end top-flow air CPU coolers were way ahead of their time, and today in 2020 we need them more than ever as motherboards' heatsinks have more RGB than actual cooling surface, and everyone pairs high-power CPUs with the cheapest of the motherboards because, as we all know, it has RGB so it goes fast anyway. The Darkrock TF has a standard layout which can be found on most top-flow air CPU coolers. In essence, this is a dual-tower CPU cooler, albeit one of these so-called towers is on the smaller side of things. The important thing is the main benefit of this design, the active cooling and airflow provided by the cooler to the motherboard VRM components and the surrounding components around the CPU socket. The heatsink of this cooler is made out of aluminum and is covered by a thick all-black matte coating which matches the overall aesthetic design of the Be Quiet brand. The cooler itself has a height of just 130mm with the two fans installed, mind you, and a combined weight of the two fans and the heatsink which is around 810 grams, which is quite light when considering the amount of metal and engineering that went into this cooler. Before we get into anything related to performance or features, let's see what is delivered with this cooler. First of all, the user manual is printed in 6 different versions, each printed in a different language. Then you get a small tube of thermal compound, a Y-short fan splitter, 4 metallic fan mounting clips and a metallic wrench. Then you have, of course, the components of the mounting system, but more on that later on because there is plenty to talk about that, believe me. By the way, it is worth saying that the cooler is very well protected by the soft foam inside the cardboard box. The heatsink of the Darkrock TF has a total of 126 aluminum-made cooling fins, 62 on the upper heatsink and 64 on the bottom smaller heatsink. A high number of cooling fins means, in simple terms, more cooling surface, but this also means that the fans have to work harder to push the air through the heatsink. The fins themselves are also painted with the same all-matte black coating as the rest of the cooler. There are a total of 6 heat pipes on this cooler and each has an outer diameter of 6mm. These heat pipes are made from nickel-plated copper and are also painted black to match the rest of the heatsink. The contact between the heat pipes and the base plate of the cooler is done through the direct soldering of the two surfaces. This ensures the best possible heat transfer and reliability. While most air CPU coolers have their heat pipes arranged in a U-shape, the Darkrock TF has them arranged in a sort of a G-shape. This way, each heat pipe will make contact with all of the aluminum cooling fins while allowing the usage of two fans. The endings of the heat pipes are fortunately covered by metal caps which have their own little design, mainly a smooth edge which is contrasting the rest of the cooler by having a glossy texture while the rest of the heatsink is matte black. As I've said in previous reviews, it is the little things that matter the most, especially in a market that demands so much in terms of the design. Another small touch on the design side of things is in the shape of the Be Quiet logo, which is placed on the sides of the lower heatsink. This logo is chromed and will reflect even the tiniest bit of light present to highlight the writing and again provide a very good contrast between the logo itself and the rest of the cooler. The Darkrock TF uses two 135mm fans. These are the Silent Wings 3 with the model number BQ-SIW3-13525MF PWM. These two fans have a maximum rated speed of 1400 RPM and a minimum speed of what I believe to be around 300 RPM. These fans have quite the engineering put into them to not only lower the overall noise generated but also to increase the performance of each fan. This is why the impellers have these lines carved into their surface. The fan also uses a 6-pole fan motor with a fluid dynamic bearing system. The cable of the fans is long enough to reach most CPU fan headers on any motherboard. The cable itself is covered by high-quality black sleeving and the connector used is a standard 4-pin. You may have already noticed that both fans have no rubber padding installed on their frame or on their corners. There's a good reason for that too, as the dampening of vibrations and unwanted noises is done by the heatsink itself. There are a total of 4 thick rubber strips attached to the upper and lower sides of the top heatsink, and those serve as a base for the fans to sit on. The base plate of the cooler is made from nickel-plated copper, just like the heat pipes. There isn't much to say about this part of the cooler, as the base is pretty simple in its design, and has a straight and smooth surface which should provide a good contact point for the CPU surface and the thermal compound. The installation process is not hard, but it's not really a walk in the park either. Fortunately, some parts of the mounting system have been changed since 2016. We start with the mounting arms, in my case the longer Intel mounting arms, and here you have a combination of a nut and a screw that, contrary to what you might expect, do not get installed on the motherboard. Not now anyway. What you need to do is to screw them together, essentially sandwiching the mounting arm in between them. Make sure to use the included wrench to tighten everything up, as this mechanism holds the entire cooler attached to the backplate. With these components installed on the mounting arms, it is time to install the arms themselves onto the cooler, and you do that at the bottom of the cooler next to the base plate. It's pretty simple, just position the arms as shown here and secure them with the included smaller screws. Then we have the backplate. Again, in my case, it's the Intel backplate. What you need to do here is to insert the bolts into the correct hole for your socket. Don't worry about the bolt falling out of the backplate. The foam around the backplate itself will hold the bolts attached. After you install the backplate and its bolts, you need to attach the small C-shaped plastic clips over the bolts, and you are doing so on the CPU socket side of the motherboard. Just clip them in place, and these clips will hold everything attached to the back of the motherboard so you can safely install the CPU cooler. And finally, you place the cooler over the CPU and thermal compound, making sure that you align the mounting arms with the studs of the backplate, and you tighten everything from the back of the motherboard. Quite an unusual mounting system, to say the least. And this is how the Darkrock TF looks like installed in my testing system. For reference, the motherboard used is a full ATX ASRock Z390 Phantom Gaming X, and while this cooler is smaller, having a height of just 130mm with the two fans installed, mind you, it is not a small cooler by any means. In terms of clearance, everything is okay for the most part. I say this because you can orient the cooler in multiple ways, and in this particular case, your motherboard's layout will have an impact in the overall clearance. In my case, the space for the RAM modules is pretty good, as there is still some space left above my Crucial Ballistics RAM kit. In terms of the graphics card clearance, things are again looking quite alright, with approximately 40mm of space between the graphics card and the heatsink. This is of course if your motherboard has its PCIe Express slots placed lower than usual, because under the CPU socket you have an M.2 SSD socket. But fortunately these days most motherboards have this layout of moving the expansion slots one slot down to allow for that M.2 socket to be installed under the CPU. The VRM clearance is okay-ish for the most part, but here you really need to be careful, as the angle of the motherboard heatsink can interfere with the cooler, especially if you have one of those RGB heatsinks that are overly tall for no good reason other than aesthetics. As is the tradition on this channel, before we head into the performance testing, I will include a noise sample of the cooler installed and its included fans, starting to spin to their maximum rated speeds and then slowing down to 0. This is done to give you a better idea of how the cooler sounds like once installed in a system, and if it has any unwanted noises such as high-pitched noises from the fans or vibrations being transmitted into the heatsink. Also, bearing ticking can be a real issue with some fans. While a decibel reading is useful, it will unfortunately not pick up these things. With the measuring device placed at a distance of 10 cm away from the system and the cooler itself, the Be Quiet Darkrock TF reached a maximum noise reading of 34 decibels with both fans spinning at their maximum speeds. This value places the cooler right next to high-end air CPU coolers such as the Noctua NH-D15 or the Darkrock Pro 4 from Be Quiet. The thermal testing is done in two stages. The used CPU, unless otherwise stated, is an Intel i9-9900K running at its factory frequency and voltage, and then overclocked manually to 5 GHz on all cores. The first test involves the Intel Burntest V2 benchmark. This places a load on the CPU which is similar with what you can encounter when playing a modern AAA video game or when video rendering. And in this test, the Be Quiet Darkrock TF reached a maximum temperature of 61 degrees Celsius, with the ambient temperature fixed at 26 degrees Celsius. The second test involves the FPU stability test found within the AIDA64 Extreme software. This benchmark places an unrealistically high load on your CPU, something which you will not encounter in your daily usage. However, it is good for our review as it helps differentiate each CPU cooler, given that with such a high CPU load placed, each cooler is pushed to its very limits in terms of performance, and in this test, the Darkrock TF reached a maximum temperature of 88 degrees Celsius, with the 9900K CPU overclocked to 5 GHz and the same 26 degrees ambient temperature as the previous test. Not a bad performance, especially for such an unique CPU cooler. The main advantage of the Be Quiet Darkrock TF is that it offers active cooling for the VRM components of your motherboard. Not only that, but its unique shape makes it easier to match with smaller system, as the cooler itself is shorter than the average tower-style Air CPU cooler. However, there are some drawbacks. Well, it's mostly a trade between performance and function. You see, while this is a high-end Air CPU cooler, it is not on par with something like the Noctua NH-D15, and there is a good reason for that. While this is a good Air CPU cooler, it does not have 2 towers or 2 heatsinks, name it as you want. Sure, the smaller part of the cooler is a heatsink, but its reduced dimensions does not really help out that much in terms of the heat dissipation. However, the Darkrock TF is truly a cooler that was ahead of its time, as it will improve the VRM temperature of your motherboard, thanks to the 2 fans that will push fresh and cool air over the CPU socket of your motherboard. And yes, there are coolers that do just that, perhaps for a lower price, but nothing will come close to the style, build quality and the low noise output of the Darkrock TF. If you like this review, then you can perhaps consider subscribing for more, and if you want to support this channel in a direct way, then in the description below you can find the Patreon and subscriber star pages of the channel.